Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Chris Rosini, the co-host. Chris, welcome to the program.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Very good. And generally on Fridays we talk about things economics, but I've found out throughout my political career that economics and foreign policy and civil liberties all blend together because they're all about the issue of liberty. But we will talk a little bit more about the finances of this government we have. And I think we've both read this article by Simon Black, who calls attention to, the runaway debt that is happening now. Huge, $52,000 per second that we spend. I mean, it's astronomical. But I remember all the way back into the days of when Barry Goldwater was challenging Eisenhower, and he was making legitimate points. But who would ever said, "Forget it, Barry. It's not going to," and it'll last for a long, long time. And besides, it's a new era. It's different rules right now. We can print money as long as we have a responsible central bank. And of course, it did. People who were very worried back then shouldn't have been too worried. But we could have made the point back then, as we do now, that if you keep a program like this together, where we have a central bank willing to loan money to anybody and everybody run up the debt and malinvestment, eventually the problem gets so big then there's a calamity. And I think that's something that we want to touch on now. But Simon certainly had some good statistics in his little article, just how serious this problem is right now.
Yes, it's astronomical how quickly the debt is rising, $52,000 per second, which means that's more money than the average person makes in an entire year. The government is spending in 1 second. I mean, we're reaching amazing levels. And we have a chart that we're going to bring up as I'm speaking here that shows just when this banking government experiment, they even call it an experiment, began. And it began in 1971, and that's when the gold standard was abolished. And all of the taxpayers, Americans, our financial control of our government came to an official end. And also for financial institutions around the world. Now the United States was able to create as much money as it wants for whatever it wants, whether it be wars, welfare for anyone and everyone. And that's how we're getting to this point, and ultimately it's going to end. So what are your thoughts, Dr. Paul, and how should this look in a real world?
Well, this is a horror when you look at this, and even though I made the point that sometimes things go slower than we might realize, and this one has gone slower, but we're maximizing how much the economy and the country can sustain, both economically and when it comes to our liberties as well. I think what this chart shows me is that there's a lot of delusions out there, whether it's in the business community, the banking community, among the politicians, and everybody who depends on the dollar, the world financial system, and the military-industrial complex, and the dependency of the deep state. If this comes down, the one good thing probably will be that the deep state will be challenged because they're the ones who own it. And they're the ones who spend it, and they're the ones who get bailed out. So I think the delusion can't last forever. So it suggests to me that if you come around to this position, why don't we start thinking, well, what will you guys have? What can we possibly have if we can't accept this idea that the government's going to provide funds for us and provide so-called capital so we can borrow and keep the economy going? The country is wealthy, and I know the debt is high, but we've been taught in college, they will say, that deficits don't matter. They're okay, and we owe it to ourselves, and we can liquidate this debt through inflation. Just print the money, and the real debt goes down, and they keep reassuring themselves. But I think what we're working on is something that they have totally deluded themselves, and it's never been done before. These last 100 years since central banking came into vogue for the worldwide at one time, and it wasn't with the snap of the fingers. It took a long time to get from 1913 up to 1971. In 71, which you showed on the chart, is when the deficit exploded. So it took a while, but now we have been living a long time, especially since 71, because that's an important date, where there's been this horrendous debt throughout the world and a horrendous amount of malinvestment and a horrendous amount of government growth. And all governments are too big, and we're starting to see that socialism, communism is a failed system. Yet there's still people out there that think that's the answer. So I think we're looking at some serious times, but also some serious opportunities, because when a system ends, we ought to be there to tell them what we might be able to provide for them.
Yes, we talk about the role of government almost every week because that's really what it boils down to. What should the role of government be? And we believe that it should be, as our founders thought, to protect our liberties, and that's it. But today, especially now that government can create its own money, that money goes everywhere, and everybody believes that they're entitled to it, and the government should do everything that could be imagined. They have their hands in. And so that's what it comes down to. And there's a lot of believers, and they always want more. It's never, well, give me less this year. And that's why this turns into an avalanche that never stops until the economic wall finally makes its appearance and puts it to an end.
This is based on the assumption that creating more monetary units and more debt, that you'll have more wealth, which is not true. Wealth is created with some of these false funds. It's like you can create wealth by, if you get hold of some counterfeit money, and the counterfeit money is undetected, and then all of a sudden you say, well, yeah, it's working, until you get caught. Now, when governments counterfeit, it's a little more difficult because they have the law of the land with them. They can violate the Constitution. They can violate, the legal tender laws and create legal tender laws that absolutely protects their monopoly. So that is the real problem. But they won't. They also use the arguments which are taught in our schools that they're doing the Lord's work. They're taking care of people, providing programs that will help the poor and build houses, taking care of our national defense. They don't mention the fact that it's militarism to meddle where we shouldn't be meddling, but they always justify this, and then they say deficits don't matter. They have been taught that, and that's why it's a bipartisan issue. You don't hear the conservative Republicans saying this debt is a problem. Yeah, a few of them, but there's a few Democrats that say that too. They just want, the control of things. But this is, I think, at a point where nobody knows when a final blow-off will be, but it will come, and then we have to start thinking, what will we have? And I think people automatically think, well, it's going to be worse. Who's going to give us insurance of our bank accounts? Well, the FDIC saves us and takes care of it, so when we have trouble, we're sure to get our money out. But the whole thing is, under today's condition, you don't automatically get all your money. The big guys get their money, and the ones that get money back, sometimes it's not worth very much. That's why it's so deceptive. So if you put money in the bank, and then when you get bailed out by the government with FDIC, it might only be worth 50 cents or 25 cents on the dollar. So that really isn't the solution. And they might say, well, what would happen if you had free markets and banking in the free market system? Well, you'd have free market insurance. You'd have insurance, and you might look to see, not for the FDIC label of saying well, they're sound, they have a sound bank and they guarantee your funds. They might look to a private source of funding of insurance and say, hey, look, if they're not sound, they lose their insurance, and it would be a public announcement. So insurance would be real. It would be measurable. They would measure. So you would have free market regulations, which would be through the insurance system. Insurance becomes very, very important in a free market economy, and that would help a whole lot. It doesn't solve the problems because there's going to always be mistakes. Even when you have sound money, there will be lending, and people will be trying to get the capital together. But the big difference there is that the capital comes from savings. Today, capital, so-called capital, comes from printing money at the central bank. And then they might ask, well, how does it work then if it's not real capital? It works because there's value out in the marketplace, there still is. And if you dilute the capital, dilute the value of the money, you really steal the effect of the capital, and they can invest it, and it does work to some degree. But the big problem is the money is distributed for political reasons, not by individuals loaning it to a friend or putting it in a bank and have the bank loan it to somebody that they judge will be a good risk. So there's a big difference. I admire people who say, I don't like any debt, I'm going to stay away from it. And I edge myself to that many times. But other people who want to invest in new ideas and invest in taking risk, the risk would be on that individual. It wouldn't be with the taxpayer. It wouldn't be with the value of the money. So it's very good. But it would be much more modest, and it would be more cautious because there would be no insurance. It would bail out bad investments. And that's what happened, of course, in '08 and '09. All the people who were making bundles off bad investments, they got bailed out. So the free market does offer many answers to the problems created by central banking as we know it.
Yes, and the problems created by the central bank, they all end the same way. For those of us who remember the stock market bubble, how the dot-coms were by the day going up $50, $100, $200 in one day. And then during the housing bubble, people were just flipping houses, entering lotteries, not even seeing what they're buying and just flipping them. This is how bubbles work. They get into a euphoric stage. We're at $52,000 per second. Can it be 75,000 per second? Perhaps. But the point to understand is the phase that we're in. And that's when things don't make any logical sense anymore, ultimately they come to an end.
And you touched on this because it has an effect on the size and scope of government. Because government is much bigger and it's financed in this way, and it also does a lot of mischief. So government, the few things that they should be doing, they don't do very well, and the things that they shouldn't be doing at all, they do too much of it, and that creates a problem. For instance, the welfare warfare state wouldn't exist without paper money. And people say, well, that's horrible. How would we defend our country? Yeah, against Saddam Hussein and against Assad and all these people that we go and start wars with. Yes, and also the welfare system, the people now who are the Bernie Sanders followers who say that they want to work for their way toward a socialist economy, but they never say we're working toward Venezuela. So there's a lot of pressure there, but the government is way too big, and it's big because of the amount of debt. Now, in a free market, there will be debt, there will be mistakes, but on a one-to-one basis and more orderly, the ones who mess up, they take their licks. The people who invested money, if the idea didn't work, the debt is liquidated. And you say, well, isn't this a magic system we have? We don't have to liquidate the debt. That is where the error in thinking comes, because all the debt, when it gets too big, has to be liquidated. It's constantly being liquidated now through inflation. They say, oh, but we don't have much inflation. We have a lot more than they will admit. Just talk to the people who can't. Just think of a whole generation right now is having trouble renting or buying a house. It's because the prices are too high. So that is liquidation of debt. And that's how they finally get rid of a debt like this. Unfortunately, we'll never have the ability nor the desire to cut off this system and say, well, let's work hard not to have more people on welfare and build more war machine. That we have to keep that going. But the debt gets liquidated. And then toward the end, it's liquidated all of a sudden because people lose confidence in the money. And that is what's going to happen. And when you think about what's going on, worldwide and the consequence of this last 100 years, when you think of the Middle East and the problems of mass migration around the world and the rejection of free market economics and sound money, they're on that curve that we just showed about the debt exploding. Well, if you did that for the world, it might even be much worse than that because everybody's involved in doing it. And I think one of the reasons why right now in the last several weeks the dollar hasn't looked too bad, but they measured against all these other countries who are in worse shape. The only thing that really counts when you look at the dollar and the value is what does it buy. And if they were more honest with us, as many people who suffer from the consequence, they'd say, you know, the dollar is losing a lot of value and we have a problem, and that's the way liquidation occurs. Matter of fact, it's even recognized by the liberals that you have to liquidate debt, but you could never go through the political difficulty of paying it down. That would be like cutting the person off from the drugs that they're addicted to. So that's not going to happen. So our effort has to be to point out the mistakes that are made, why they make it, why they depend on debt and economic interference, why it's wrong to think the welfare state is good. Because if they don't reject this, then they will have trouble accepting the notion that liberty and free markets and sound money is an alternative. And quite frankly, as imperfect as it was for the first 150 years of our country, that's how we became the wealthiest country in the world and had the largest middle class. But we've even slipped from that. In spite of the shortcomings all around the world, there are other countries that are now beating us at economic policy. It's awfully weird that a country like China, who claims they're communist, are outdoing us in economics. They work, they make products, they sell them, they save money, and then they invest. And then we get hysterical if they come over and buy some property we don't want them to buy. But nobody mentions the fact, well, you know, without the Chinese buying up our debt, we couldn't exist either. But all that is going to come to an end. And then, Chris, we're going to have to think a lot more about all the efforts that we have to make and a lot of other people have to make to get a better understanding of sound economic policy.
Yes, and an opportunity will present itself because when this government bubble bursts, and even though we have no idea when that'll be, it will burst, there will be a lot of illusions that will be shattered, and there are plenty of illusions. I mean, we have this government that is broke, and there's people saying they need free health care and free college education, a $15 an hour job provided by government. These are all illusions, and there's going to be a lot of people that are it's going to be shattered, and they're not going to know where to turn. Hopefully our viewers will have in their minds the ideas of liberty and will be able to share them when these people look for answers, because they're going to look for answers and they'll run from government. Once they know that the jig is up and the government's not going to help them anymore, they'll run somewhere else.
Right.
If you have the answers for them, that would be great. Very
good. And I think that you mentioned the word that I use a lot, and I think that's where the emphasis has to be, and that is the preservation of liberty. They use the excuse that we're preserving our liberty and our Constitution by fighting wars in the Middle East. That's total nonsense. But people don't advocate and work for the principles of liberty because they either don't understand them or they don't quite believe it's in their best interest. Because basically people do what they believe is in their best interest, and if there's a free lunch, it's pretty tempting. And for a long time, when a country is very wealthy, it takes a long time to destroy the currency and destroy all the wealth. But that's what we're witnessing now, the destruction of wealth, the shrinking of the middle class, the division between those who have and those who do not have, and the social conflicts that come with it, and then a disintegration of our social system. When you look at our educational system, our medical system, it all goes downhill. But it starts with the idea and the confidence of being willing to work for a free society where the individual is important rather than different groups ganging up on other groups to see what they can get ahead of the other one. And of course, the financial system and the banking system we have is actually what they've used for so long. Chris, do you have a final statement that you would like to make on this issue?
No, but I do want to thank everyone again. We had a great week traffic-wise and subscriber-wise, so thank you. And the word of liberty is getting out there, slowly but surely.
Yeah, I was very pleased about our statistics. They've been improving a whole lot. Sometimes economic policy and spending too much isn't the most popular subject, but believe me, it's very, very important. And if somebody's more interested in only the social conditions and civil liberties, might say, well, that's, money doesn't deal with that. Or if they say that I'm mainly interested in cutting back on the military. The thing of it is, they're all connected. Liberty is very important. And if liberty is designed for the protection of the individual and the responsibility, it's the responsibility thing is what's hard for people to accept. You mean I'd be responsible and you let me have my freedoms, but what if I have a tough job? What if I get sick? What if I get hurt? Who's going to take care of me? Well, who takes care of you now? The whole thing is, if you say, I might not have enough money for education, then you end up with an educational system we have. It doesn't work. This whole idea that if you didn't have government, people wouldn't be taken care of. I think that is what's absolutely wrong, because when you look back and look at history, you find out that people do get taken care of, never with perfection, but not with the consequences of socialism and communism. So there's every reason in the world for us to fight and strive for a free market and individual liberty. And that is what we will continue to do on this channel to promote that cause. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.